Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this BCS Women's sponsored event on the Agile Inclusion Paradox, which Jo is going to talk us through. I'm going to just do a quick introduction to Jo before we start, so Jo is the founder and director of Inclusion Engineering, a social enterprise offering diversity and inclusion consultancy in technology and engineering domains. Along with this, she is a global lead for diversity and inclusion at Aviva, a leading FTSE 100 technology company. She is also an active committee member for BCS Women and has recently taken over the role as treasurer as well. Jo began her career as an engineer, developing enterprise software for global industries spanning oil and gas, automotive, aerospace and marine sectors. Having pivoted her focus from technical to human dimensions of engineering, Jo now works as a business psychologist. Tonight she is going to talk about her research about diversity in tech teams and the Agile Inclusion Paradox. So thank you for joining this evening, and over to you, Jo.
Thanks, Andrea. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thank you very much for joining us. I'm excited to share this research with you. So I'm going to try and make this as interactive as possible. Obviously, a webinar, you are all on mute, but we'll have some questions and time to speak at the end. So I'll talk through the material, and as we go, I've got some polls and some questions to ask you all. So yeah, please reply to the polls. I can get to know you a little bit as well as you getting to know me. Post any questions you've got in the chat or in the questions drop down that you'll see in the GoToWebinar controls. So let's just start with the poll, make sure that they're working all right. One thing I'm very curious about is, how did you all hear about this webinar? So to me, it's magic. I told the BCS I have a webinar, they put it on their page, people sign up. How did you actually hear about it? Can you see the questions, everyone? It's either the BCS events page, BCS emails, via some of the women, the BCS Women channels that we have, social media, or something else. And feel free to type what your something else is in the chat. Wow, I see lots and lots of others. You're going to have to tell me in the chat. Okay, so we have 88% of us voted. I'll close the poll now. So 27% of you said BCS emails, 42% of you said other. So yeah, type in the chat. I'm very curious to know how you actually heard about this. Please do let me know. So I'd like to start off by just telling you a little bit about me. I think it's quite, it's nice to know who's speaking, and also it's quite important in terms of the research that I'm going to present as well. So something that I've always quite appreciated about the way that psychologists present is that they understand and communicate about their own involvement in the subject and how that might influence the conclusions that they've come to and the reasons for carrying out the research the way that they did. So as Andrea mentioned, I'm founder of a social enterprise called Inclusioneering, very newly formed. We're offering diversity and inclusion consulting to tech and engineering firms, as the name implies. So alongside this, half-time, I'm also global lead for diversity and inclusion at Aviva. My background is in engineering, software for engineering particularly, so CAD systems, information management systems. You can see I've worked from the, the very tiny scale stuff in these pictures on the left with the circuit boards, the electronic chips, to the absolutely enormous. My preference is in the absolutely enormous. Honestly, I'm a techie at heart and an engineer at heart. I just get very excited when I see these kind of images. So despite my role shift, I'm still very much about tech and engineering. So I've worked as a software engineer, product manager, worked up to be a head of a department in my work. And then about 3 years ago, I had quite a major shift and decided that this curiosity I had about why there's so few people like me around me in my work really became really quite an obsession, to be honest. And I decided to sign up to take a master's degree in organisational psychology to much better understand kind of the dynamics of diversity within tech and engineering, and gain some of the skill set needed to really be able to lead change in these areas. So the research that I'm going to talk to you about has come from my psychology degree that I've taken. So over the past year, I've been conducting the study that has led to the presentation that you'll see today. So as well as all of this, I'm also mum to 2 boys, Leon and Elliot. They are 9 and 7. There's non-zero chance that you're all going to meet them too. They've been instructed, do not come in this evening, but there's a pretty high chance that you'll be aware of them. So apologies in advance. I hope that they're not disruptive, but you probably will know about their presence at some point. So just to get grounded on what we're going to talk about, the title obviously bashes together quite a few different concepts here, and you may be wondering how on earth they're related. So I'm going to start with just an overview of what Agile is to me. And I'm aware that actually everybody has a different interpretation and a different way of running Agile. So I'll just talk around the things that I'm including in my definition here. And then we'll talk about what do Agile and inclusion actually have to do with each other? Why are these things coming together as a paradox? What's behind this title that's here? So really this then leads on to the question, are all the good things that we see in Agile culture enough to build equality and inclusion in tech organisations? And that's really what leads into my research and the findings that I'd like to present to you. So before I go on, I'd just like to ask you all another question, which will help me to hopefully present in the way that's most relevant for you all. So let me just get this up. What's your main reason for attending today? Is it to learn about how you can get more traction in your own career? Maybe inclusion is something that you feel you need for yourself. Maybe it's something that you want to build within teams that you're managing. So is this something that you want to be able to be a better ally to other people? Is it something that you want to be improving in teams that you lead, perhaps? Is it for all of those things, or is it something else completely? So please enter your answers and let me know. Oh.
So the poll disappeared.
Oh dear, I'm not sure I can do it again.
No, it's back now.
There we go.
No, but it says 0 results, so.
Oh dear. Okay,
We didn't get to
I won't know
vote
the
on
answer to
that
that. If you have any burning desire to tell me, please type in the chat. I'll be very interested to hear why you're here. So let me carry on. So I'd like to start by telling you a story about a friend of mine, anonymized friend of mine, so I'm not actually revealing any actual person here. We'll call her Shanaz. Shanaz comes from a fairly traditional Pakistani background, family. She's grown up as a British Pakistani, and she's taken a maths master's degree from a top university. She's really into the techie side of things, really loves technology, loves the way that maths and technology come together and that she can really use those skills. And she started her career as a software developer. And what she was really aspiring to do is to become more and more technical, go down the most technical routes in her career, and was thinking, along the lines of a software architect or a systems architect or something like this for herself. So a few years back, she got a job at a firm, well, called them Fubar Solutions, in one of their agile development teams. She's quite a natural people-y person. She's a good team player and really considers the skills of the other people within the team and how she fits around them. So she found that she was fitting her strengths and her interests around what the other team members were contributing as well. But this didn't really pan out quite how she'd expected. She finds herself becoming more and more of a people organizer within the team, and not so many of the technical tasks are really coming her way. There's other people who are speaking up for those and always getting the most involved kind of algorithmic tasks that she then doesn't have the opportunity for. But the team seems to like what she's doing. She gets good feedback about the work that she does, and actually soon she was offered the role of a project manager. So seeing an opportunity, she decided to accept the role. But now wind forwards a few years to now, and actually she's not too sure that this was actually a great decision for her. She's feeling that her progression has stagnated somewhat, and she's not really sure, did she make the right choice to go away from her more technical interests? Because they're still there, she's still wanting to do that kind of thing. So she's at a bit of a crossroads. What is she going to do to reignite her career? So I'd just like to ask you another question here. Do you know anyone like Shanaz? Is Shanaz someone who's familiar to you? So hopefully I don't mess this one up. Your options are, this could be me. I know someone who's like Shanaz. There are some aspects that are familiar, or I have no idea who you're talking about, Jo. Okay, votes coming in, up to almost 80%. Just give it another few seconds. Okay, so I'll close the poll. 16% of you said this could be me. 24% of you know someone who is like Shanaz, and about half of you think that some of these aspects are familiar to you. So I think this is a good response. Helps me to know the kind of people that you know in your teams, and actually good to know that actually this is somewhat familiar to all of you, really. So I'd like to zoom out a little and talk a bit about the context that Shanaz is working in. I'm sure that many of you are quite familiar with some of these figures, but maybe those of you who have joined really from the Agile interest are less familiar. So I'll just take you through some of the figures of where we are in the tech industry. So these figures come from the BCS Insights research that gets published annually. So in the UK, we have around 17% women working in the IT industry. That's actually up a little this year. It's a little higher than 17% now, but actually over the past decade, this figure has largely been unchanged. And that's despite there really being some quite prominent campaigns and interventions to be making change in this. So for those of you who aren't from the UK, I'll explain the acronym. BAME is Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. This is an acronym that gets used in the UK to talk about ethnic and racial minorities here. So in the UK, we have around about 18% people from racial minority backgrounds working in IT. This is actually, on the face of it, fairly representative of the population. But when you look under the hood of this, actually, we see that Asians are overrepresented and Black people particularly are underrepresented in IT. So there's complexity that's hiding underneath this figure. What we do see in common for women and people from racial minority backgrounds is that their rates of progression as we go up the organisational ladder just aren't matching that of white people and of men. So when we're looking at IT director level, the number of people from racial minority backgrounds has dropped to just 9%, it's halved. And looking at leadership positions in the tech industry, for women, that drops to 5%. So we can really see that there's a much lower progression rate in these groups. And actually, not only the low progression rate, we see the exit rate of people from these underrepresented groups leaving STEM careers at higher rates than they leave other career fields as well. So I'm going to zoom out again. Of course, this is not telling us great things about the career prospects for women and for racial minorities, but actually this has impacts beyond individual impacts, about economic scale and societal impacts as well. So really, we're in a phase that's called Industry 4.0. Often now we're seeing digital transformation sweeping across industry, and more different types of firms are really having digital presence in one form or another. And particularly interesting is rapid growth in technologies like the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence and machine learning. So the Digital Disruption Index found that only 18% of school leavers have got the right digital skills and experience in 2019 for actually entering the technology workforce. Accenture carried out an interesting piece of research that calculated that over £140 billion in GDP will be foregone if that gap isn't closed by 2028. So that's a real huge economic impact of these missing skills. And of course, if we can be attracting more people to enter the industry, that's one way that this gap can be closed. But this isn't the only impact. And one that I think is becoming increasingly important are the reports that we're seeing in the media about bias in automated decision making, and particularly as autonomous systems and artificial intelligence are responsible for making decisions about who gets housing, who gets bank loans, people's access to healthcare. This becomes increasingly concerning. Now, of course, there's many factors that are going to go into solving this kind of bias. A more diverse workforce is one that is a particularly important aspect to making sure that we have representation within the workforce to make sure that tech is really benefiting people equally across society. So I'm just to move on now and talk a little bit about the Agile team and what I mean by this. So I'm going to just ask another question before we go on. Learn a bit about you. What's your experience or interest with Agile? Are you an experienced team member? Do you lead Agile teams? You're just getting started? No real experience, but quite curious to know more? Or are you only here about the diversity and inclusion stuff? Okay, I think most of you have voted now. I'll close this. So about a third of you are experienced Agile team members, a quarter of you are Agile leaders, a few of you just getting started, and a few of you mostly interested for the diversity and inclusion elements. So it's great to have a good mix of people with different experiences here. So when I talk about Agile, I mean quite a broad definition. I talk about agility being the ability for an organisation to be innovative, to collaborate, and create value. And a real key facet of it is the ability to dynamically adapt to change. Now, Agile is often talked about as the different Agile frameworks, and these are different implementations based upon the Agile values and principles that are used by software and IT teams often. So these are characterised by putting people and their interactions central to the values of the team, and that guides the decisions that are made and the way that the team work together. It's really important that the team are empowered. So an Agile team brings together cross-functional skill sets, and so the team is able to own every problem that comes to them, self-organise to find the best solution and to implement that solution. Now, the team will work in a reflective way. If it's a Scrum team, they will have sprints where at the end of each sprint or at the end of each iteration, they will reflect upon what's happened in a retrospective. It's also called inspect and adapt. So they'll really examine not only the output of what they have made, but how they have done it in the process and adapt to make improvements so that they can do better in future. So the team, as I mentioned, are self-organising. They have the skill sets they need, and they come together to discuss the customer needs at hand, break them into a set of tasks that need to be carried out and distributed amongst the team. Now, being an organisational psychologist, I do lots and lots of reading about psychology, particularly when it relates to diversity and inclusion. And a book that I've really enjoyed in the last couple of years is this one by Iris Bonnet, who's a psychologist at Harvard University. This one's particularly focused on gender equality. So something I found really fascinating actually reading this book was just how much of what she recommends as best practice for inclusion in organisations aligns with what we already do in Agile teams and have been doing really for well over a decade. So some of the things that she recommends are that it's really vital that inclusion is embedded within the organisation's values. So really looking to include the skill sets and the benefits that and experiences that each different person within the team can bring. She talks about the need to have processes that are inclusive by design, and where it's transparent about how those things work. Going on, it's important to have opportunity that the work is distributed equally amongst the team members, and that the teams reflect upon where they are and how they can improve. So I think you'll probably see here that there's an awful lot of parallels between some of these best practices for inclusion in organisations and some of the things that are just day-to-day normal within an agile team. It's really built on a very similar set of values and principles. So given everything I was just talking about with the numbers, the representation within tech and how difficult that's been to shift, this makes me wonder, if we're doing all of these things right, why does tech have such a pipeline problem? So let's have a look about the research that has been done about this. And there's been quite a lot of it. So I've had to look over research from organisational psychology. There's lots of research that's been done by computer scientists, by engineers, organisations such as McKinsey, and so on. So this brings together quite a few different sources here. So as we're looking at people coming into the industry, we have tech graduates. Is about 19% women in the UK who are graduating from a university course that's computer science, software engineering, something of those sorts. Now, something I think is quite telling actually is it's pretty much impossible to find those figures for racial minority people. There's just a lack of data that really doesn't shed light on the comparable figure for racial minorities. So what I've written here is the overall figure within the industry at 18%. So as we look along what you could call an employee life cycle, we'll go through stages of what HR would call talent acquisition. So we're looking for new people to come into the organisation, how we attract them, how we recruit them, then into how we assess people's performance, and then looking at how they have pay increases and promotions as they take the next steps into their next more senior roles. So at each stage of this pipeline, we can see actually that bias can take place, and that this can lead to us losing people from this pipeline. So within talent acquisition, actually lots and lots of cases where job adverts will have stereotyped language or stereotyped images, images that are not diverse and maybe only show a certain portion of the population. I think companies are getting much better actually at recognising that their images need to be diversified. I think there's now, even conversely, quite a lot of cynicism that they're so diverse it's not, it doesn't seem genuine. But a much more real thing that companies are yet to address, from what I'm seeing, is when we're looking at who is put on stage and who speaks at events, who's there at the recruitment events, or who's making the keynote speeches at different industry events. And that is, again, lacking visible diversity. And all of these things contribute to the attractiveness of organisations to candidates. So once someone has been attracted to a firm, there's then the potential for bias in CV or resume screening and in interview. So we lose some people. Now come into someone's career year on, time for a performance assessment. Again, there's a likelihood for bias to be creeping in here, affected by stereotyped expectations of people. This becomes much more likely actually in situations where someone's performance is ambiguous. So I'd say actually within something like a team-based activity where it's not always clear who has contributed, what's the outcome. This is a good example of where that ambiguity may lead to some increased probability of bias happening. And of course, time pressure as well. People are more likely to rely upon quick impressions rather than well thought out assessments. There's also a myth that seems to perpetuate itself through industries like the tech industry that meritocracy exists. Actually, research has shown that managers who have stereotypes beliefs, but also have a strong sense that they have objective judgment, are actually far more likely to make biased decisions and assessments than others. Now coming on to pay and promotion, we find even for equal performance assessments, women and people from racial minorities don't fare so well in pay and promotions as their white male counterparts. Now, a little note in here, it's not all bad news, a slightly gloomy slide, but in the UK, we measured the gender pay gap each year. We have a pay gap of 11% in the UK engineering industry, which is actually below that of other industries within the UK. So engineering and tech are actually doing better than others in this regards. But it still exists. And the overall outcome of this is that at each stage of this pipeline, if you may, we see people falling away. This is also known as the leaky pipeline sometimes, which is why I've drawn it this way. So we actually then see higher exit rates of women and racial minorities from their tech careers than we see men leaving. So the female exit rate, I say here, exceeds the male exit rate by 5.4 percentage points, and actually we don't see this in other industries. So this isn't something that's just a gender difference, this is something that is specific to the tech and the STEM industries. And so the outcome of all of this is we just see lower representation with increasing seniority. Let me see, I'm going to ask you another question at this point. I'd like to know, what is your main experience with diversity and inclusion? Do you have lived experience as a member of an underrepresented group? Next one, I consider myself to be an ally. I lead diversity and inclusion programs or activities. I have no experience, but I'm curious to learn more, or I'm only really here about making Agile better. Okay, votes are slowing down, so I'll close the poll. So we have just the last final few. Thank you, everyone. Okay, so final votes. We have 42% lived experience as a member of an underrepresented group. 25% of you consider yourselves to be an ally. 20% of you lead some kind of diversity and inclusion program or group. A few of you no real experience, but curious to know more, and a few of you also having main interest really in doing better with Agile. That's great, thank you very much, everyone. So coming back to the slides, everything that we saw on the past slide to me makes me wonder, well, these are all very big ticket events that happen, once every now and then. We look for a job, maybe once a year if it's really not going all that well. We get promotions, pay rise once every few years if you're doing okay. So what about what happens in between? Can we see disparity happening in the more day-to-day stuff? And actually, if we can see it happening in the day-to-day, can we interrupt it in the day-to-day and stop having these kind of big ticket moments where we've got these gender and race differences that are really opening up? So if we can understand in the day-to-day, perhaps by these small kind of incremental actions, we can really change the whole big picture. So my first step in answering this question was to understand a bit more about the psychological factors that could be contributing to cause the disparity that we see. So here's my diagram of the Agile team. So let's imagine that this is Shanaz's team and they're here with their task board, which is showing the nice transparency of what the work is. They're having a good old discussion to work out how to distribute these tasks, and they're really valuing each other and considering their interactions as they go. So these are all the good things that we know that Agile can be bringing for us. But what about everything else that might be going on here? Well, first of all, it's the old favourite that diversity and inclusion people will always talk about first. It's stereotyped expectations. and these really are a key factor within this. So this is a completely normal psychological process. The social world, just like the physical world, is a very complex place. Our brains have limited capacity, especially when we have to make very quick judgments and decisions, and this is a process that simplifies the social world, so we rely on stereotypes. And what's really interesting about them is that they're most usually a culturally held belief that is shared by people throughout a whole culture. Now, along with stereotyped expectations, that gives us expectations about relative status between people in different social groups. And again, in the Agile team, I find this really fascinating, actually, that we've got both our demographic groups going on within in here. So, for example, gender and race, but also we've got the different roles within the team. So, developers, testers, user experience, scrum masters. This all comes with some different status ascribed to it. And actually, if you start to think about who's in what different roles, what type of people tend to do what roles, actually, it can be quite fascinating to see, that there is actually some alignment potentially between high power groups and lower power groups within kind of social expectation and also within that kind of team dynamic. And so some of these processes here are what can lead to bias and prejudice when people are making evaluations and decisions about others. On the whole, I'm glad to say that in my experience, this is very rarely overt. It's quite rare to see overt bias in the workplace, at least where I've been nowadays. But what this means is that it really just becomes much more veiled and much less obvious to identify. And this is what often gets referred to as a microaggression. So this is, as an example, a slight or something that causes offence to somebody from whoever this is targeted at. So an example could be, a well-meaning colleague saying to a female colleague, "You're far too pretty to be a software engineer." So of course this is probably meant well. It was even meant as a compliment, but it also subtly undermines her value as a software engineer and gives question to people's evaluations of her competence in that role. So it can also be something that is non-verbal. An example that I always think about for this is I met a really fascinating lady at a talk that she was giving. She had been a chief constable within the Cambridgeshire Police. She's a black lady, obviously very senior within the police force, and she was talking about how not only in her role did she quite frequently get mistaken for somebody more junior, and one of her white colleagues would be assumed to be the boss. Actually, it had happened on a few occasions that people had also assumed she was the person being taken into custody. So, I really found that quite shocking. She told the story with great humour, but, an event that really highlights the impact of this, and actually the embarrassment for people on both sides of this as well, when the mistake is realised. So microaggression can also be something that's environmental. So within the engineering industries, one that I've heard about really quite frequently is there being no facilities on site for women to go use the loo. They've got to wait till the end of the day because it assumes that everyone on site is a man. Or overalls that are only designed in male shape and not having clothes that properly fit a female body. So all of these things can lead to what's known as belonging uncertainty. Somebody can feel that they're not really like the others in the group, and it makes them wonder, is this really for me? Another process that it can lead to is something called stereotype threat, where somebody from an underrepresented group or from a group who is stereotyped negatively can be aware that others may be judging them by this stereotype, and they're concerned about inadvertently meeting that stereotype and reinforcing that belief. And both of these things cause additional stress and pressure on people in underrepresented groups, and that can really impact their performance as well. So all of this then goes towards shaping somebody's motivations. What is it that they're aiming for and aspiring for in future? So they'll think about, what do people like me do? Who can I see who's successful, who's like me, whose path I can follow in? If they don't see people like them, actually it's less high in the minds of what they may be doing. but also these feelings of lacking of belonging or experiences of bias can impact expectations that they have of how successful they'd be in a particular path, and that can also impact their motivations to move ahead with something. Now, something I find very interesting in teams is the team dynamic and how people behave together. So it's a really fascinating bit of research actually done by, in the engineering domain, looked at how group norms can reinforce team behaviours. So they looked at engineering project groups, and they found actually that the skill sets and the experiences and the things that people came into the group with really quite quickly became established as the norm, and they saw silos forming. So as the team went through their interactions of working out who does what, okay, they say, okay, well, Jo, we know her for this particular thing, she'll have that task. Next iteration comes around, well, this is the kind of thing that Jo does well, so let's give it to her. And actually people then find themselves on tramlines or within silos, and the group behaviour just serves to reinforce that particular path that they've been put on. So one more question for you before we move on. Do you recognise any of these dynamics in the teams you're in or have been in? Yes, all of them. Yes, some of them frequently. Yes, some of them sometimes. Nope. And I've not witnessed this. I don't know.
Jo, whilst people are answering the poll, there are a couple of things that maybe that just to touch on whilst we're getting them to finish that off.
Okay.
Yeah, and some feedback really is, you know, people were asking about whether there were how it's not just a it's how we treat people on an everyday basis, and the bullying and the harassment and day-to-day aggressions. They felt that that maybe was a step that's missed out, but I think you've covered that now. But the other interesting aspect was that how a lot of companies are using stock images rather than real images that actually represent their organizations.
Yeah, that's very true.
And then, you know, what percentage of the tech graduates are women of ethnic minorities? Do you have any idea on that?
I don't. I did actually spend quite a while trying to find those figures, and actually just even finding what proportion of tech graduates are ethnic minorities was next to impossible. So then that intersectional view on it, I was unable to get that. I couldn't even get the single dimension when it came to that particular figure.
Okay, and one where it's myth or fact, women who make it in tech are better than male counterparts, because they've had to be in order to get a look in. And someone else has commented that they believed that they were mutually exclusive, and I was just wondering whether you had a comment on that.
I think that, well, I certainly know some colleagues who always favour recruiting women because of exactly that view. Actually, you know, they've had to work so much harder to get to this particular point. So, you know that their character and their determination and their skill set are really going to be, you know, top notch. I don't think I can comment from a psychological point of view on it. Personally speaking,
no, that's fine. It was a bit of devil's advocate as well. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's close the poll and move on. So about 46% of you have seen some of these kind of dynamics sometimes. 23% of you, some of them frequently. 19% have seen all of them, and then 8 or 9% of you not too sure. So watch out in your teams as you go back into work for the rest of the week. See if you see things maybe in a slightly different light. So all of this kind of background research, you know, framing my question, you know, is agile culture enough to build inclusion and equality, really then started to come together in my mind I think you can tell my answer to that question. You know, there's not enough there. We can see from the figures that we're not gaining equality within tech at the moment. So my question then morphed into, well, what are those factors that are influencing career progression and retention for people in underrepresented groups in tech? So, you know, the previous slide gave a whole list of factors that might be there and might be impacting it. But what can we measure, and what can we learn from what we measure? So I was wondering, can you see micro inequities in the way that tasks are assigned within the groups? For example, do tasks align with stereotypes? So the high status tasks, the most important stuff going to a certain group of people versus the lower status ones? Or is there any alignment between kind of masculine and feminine stereotypes work, for example, like the most technical stuff versus the most user-centric stuff? And resulting from this, can we see any differences in people's career attitudes, by which I mean their job satisfaction or their career aspirations or their commitment to their careers? And as a result of this, really the reason why I want to know all of this is, does this give us any pointers to any new things that we can try that might actually shift some of these kind of sticky figures that we've been seeing? So what I did was to carry out an online survey. I called it the Agile Experiences Survey, advertised pretty much through social media, asking people from Europe and the United States and Canada to take part in this survey. I specifically kept it within those cultures because all of these dynamics I talked about on that previous slide really vary quite a lot with culture. So kind of the power kind of hierarchy structure of cultures and the masculine and feminine dimensions really quite different in different cultures. So I wanted to keep it within Western culture just to have you know, some I guess consistency in who was replying and being able to make sense of what I got back. So I was quite deliberately neutral in the way that I named the survey. I didn't want to influence the way that people answered by giving away too much information about its purpose to start with. So that's why it got this name. Of course, it's important that participants do know what they've taken part in. So they were given an information sheet when they started, which told them it was about understanding their experiences in agile teams. And then at the end of the sheet, the survey, sorry, they had a full debrief that then explains the purpose was to also understand any racial and gender differences within those experiences. So these are the things that I asked them. So first up, about task assignment. I had advertised it for people in all roles in Agile teams, but knowing how variable people's implementations of Agile are, I wanted to make sure that actually people are working in teams where their work items are assigned as that group process. So I asked, you know, is it by some Agile method or by a supervisor? Then I asked some questions to gauge some of those dimensions I was talking about, how important the work was, how technical it was, and how user-centric it was, as compared to others in the team. So then it went on to some standard questionnaires that are kind of well established about job satisfaction, about career aspirations, and about career commitment. So again, because I didn't want to influence the way people answered the questions, I kept all of the demographic questions to the end of the survey. So that's where I asked about gender and race. I also asked about their age and seniority so that I could control for other factors that might well be influencing some of the answers to these questions. So it's a reasonably substantial survey, took about 10 to 15 minutes for people to complete. So what did I find, and what does it all mean? So I had around about 150 people take part, but then had to take some people out because they didn't actually meet the criteria. So about 124 remained, which has then contributed to the analysis that you'll see. So 52% were white men. Looking by gender, not intersectional here, just 36% were women, and 19% were from racial minorities. Statistically speaking, actually, the more even the size of the groups, the better, kind of more valid the results I'll get were. So a point that I should make here is that the numbers were quite low for the racial minorities. I'd actually hoped to be able to analyse as separate groups as well. As we've just been talking about, experience is really very varied. But unfortunately, that group wasn't large enough, so it's analysed as one single group. Although I'm appreciating that that isn't a homogeneous group. So first findings, regardless of gender or race, actually I smiled when I saw it. Some nice outcomes was that people who had really got their tasks assigned in an agile manner had the highest job satisfaction, higher than people who had a process called agile but had a supervisor tell them what to do. Another nice outcome of it, that kind of gives some boost to the agile process is that I found correlation between how important people rate their work as being and their career aspirations and career commitment. Now, of course, within an agile team where people have got some ability to be influencing what tasks they work on, you presume that actually that means people are choosing work that they do believe is important and that it's going to be beneficial to their aspirations and commitment. So I'll just put on screen what some of this looked like. So in graphs, this is how the job satisfaction looks. And you can see here the agile score for job satisfaction on this measure is higher than that when the task is assigned to them by somebody in some position of authority. And this was a statistically significant finding. What it did mean, though, was that including these people with authority who were assigning them tasks was going to complicate the rest of the results. And so the analysis from here on just focuses on the people who had that agile methodology of task assignments. So looking at this group, what really stood out to me actually was that, although on that slide a few screens back, we saw that there's all of these similar psychological mechanisms that are working on team members, that doesn't translate into meaning that people in underrepresented groups all had the same experiences as each other. In fact, far from it. Women and racial minority participants really had quite different profile of results. So particularly what we saw was that women were found to have less technical tasks than men. I think probably most people in an agile technical team won't be at all surprised to hear that, but this was something that did show up in the results as a statistically significant finding. We also found that racial minority participants had lower job satisfaction. I think this one was particularly concerning, looking at the particular questions that people in racial minorities tended to answer lower scores for, seemed to be related to kind of autonomy and freedom to use their own methodologies and to solve problems their own way. So, given that we're in an agile team who are meant to be empowered, that's a concerning kind of a result to see. So let me just show you that again. So here is the graph that shows people's perceived task technicality, and you can see actually that a very high proportion of women report that they have below average technicality tasks, and most men say they have average technicality tasks or above average technicality tasks. So quite a clear difference here between genders. And then looking at job satisfaction scores by race, you can see here the white and the racial minority scores, and actually that's not much overlap between the error bars here, really quite a distinct difference. So one thing in this result really confused me to start with. Why don't we see gendered job satisfaction differences? As you'd expect, research would does relate job satisfaction to kind of turnover rates in organisations. So pretty logically speaking, you're not happy with your job, you leave. So we know women are leaving in greater rates. They seem to have equal job satisfaction. Why is that? What are we seeing? For racial minorities, we could see actually that job satisfaction difference, which can explain the higher rate of turnover, but the female rate is unexpected here. Now, something else that I really liked about the research was that this just broke aspiration myths. Particularly regarding women, you often hear, women just aren't getting the most senior jobs because they're not aspiring to it. People will make assumptions that, actually they're tied between family commitments and work commitments, and the work aspiration just isn't there. This research completely turned that on its head. Actually, what I saw was that racial minorities especially, and also women, have got higher aspirations than white men. Again, this is unexpected given that they have lower progression rates, and it's actually the white men who have the highest progression rates. But this is actually consistent with other research that's really found similar things. So if we look here at the career aspiration scores, the scale I used puts things as an overall aspiration, and then you'll see breaks it into different types of aspiration. So here, looking at white people and racial minority people, you can see here that difference between these groups. And again, this is a statistically significant finding. So because of the nature of the results, these ones were analysed using a different technique. So you can see here the breakdown between 4 groups, so white men, white women, racial minority men, racial minority women. So these 2 subscales showed, again, statistically significant differences, showing here that particularly racial minority people have got higher aspirations as far as leadership and education goes. But actually women generally do also have higher educational aspirations than men. So why aren't we seeing progression in these groups? And actually this really makes me think about what we hear quite often, that particularly people in racial minorities have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition, or to get equal recognition. And actually you can imagine that these frustrated ambitions can be contributing to some of that gap in job satisfaction that we particularly see for the racial minority participants. And again, this is consistent with some other findings that show that those aspirations and satisfaction isn't actually enough to have people stay within their career paths. Something I think that's also interesting that's not written on the slide is that the BCS each year in their insights report do look at the educational achievement of people within IT careers. And what we can see there is that women and people in racial minorities for equal job levels with white people or with men do actually have a high level of education. So it's not that they have aspirations that they're not actually working towards and achieving. They are achieving these things, but it obviously isn't translating into that career progression that people are aiming for. Another aspect that I find interesting in this is relating to the fact that women reporting equal job satisfaction to men. It makes me think that although we can see that big difference in the type of work that they're carrying out with regards to the technicality, women themselves aren't necessarily perceiving this as micro-iniquities in the task assignment. However, I did also see a correlation in these results in terms of the perceived task importance being correlated with the perceived task technicality. So the people who had the most technical tasks were also reporting that these are the most important tasks. So that correlation really concerns me, actually, for women within the teams, that even if they themselves don't correlate, technicality with importance, the majority of their team, being men, will do. And their task importance may be perceived as lesser than that of their peers because they're choosing those less technical tasks. So in both of these dimensions here, it makes me wonder, is what we're seeing really a cultural phenomenon? Is it that these educational and leadership aspirations of people in racial minorities are not valued so highly by organisations as the people who have these aspirations? Are these technical tasks more highly valued by the organisations than by the women and the men in the teams? So is there a contribution here of the organisational culture to that progression gap? The things that we're seeing women and racial minorities achieving, aspiring to, just not actually valued by the organisations that they're working within. And certainly this also resonates with some other research that shows that women and racial minorities tends to report actually that it's workplace culture that is the biggest barrier to their careers. In the case of women, as opposed to family commitments, which is often what is assumed to be the cause, but not actually so often reported by women as the primary cause. So what are the implications of all of this? Well, first up, Agile has actually got some really good qualities. We did see that increased job satisfaction for people working within Agile teams, and that ability for the team to adapt to what work is carried out by who in the team does mean that there's great opportunities there for building greater equality. However, this research is showing that women and racial minority people do have different experiences from white and male counterparts within the team. And the Agile by itself just isn't giving us the inclusion and equality that we would hope to have within our teams. We need to actually intervene and make conscious effort to be putting that into the dynamic. So some recommendations from me. For individuals, many of you said that you are members of an underrepresented group within your team. I think it's important to know that this dynamic exists where you will get channeled along a particular path if you're not consciously trying to carve out your own distinctive path and break those expectations that people have. So it's really worth taking time to reflect upon your own value and map out how that fits with the career potential that you believe you have and the direction that you want to go in. And of course, talk to your team about it, let them know where you're headed, and resist work that isn't aligning to your aspirations. For organisations, this is particularly to the point where I believe that there's a misalignment between the aspirations that individuals have and what organisations actually expect to see for career progression. I see a lot of tech firms don't really have a great, clear, structured approach to career progression. It's kind of left to chance a bit, or it's very much individual discretion in different teams. That can hurt minority people, where there can be all of these factors that are influencing how they're perceived. So it's really important that that career progression path is mapped out clearly and in a structured way, and that cultural factors that might impact that are examined and accounted for. So for Agile team members and leaders, so for being an ally and for leading Agile teams, actually, I really believe we can use the Agile ceremonies that we have. I think all of the hooks are there within Agile to be doing much, much more than we are with inclusion. So we can enhance the sprint planning, the sprint review, the retrospectives, to really put consideration of inclusion and equality into those things. So who gets assigned which tasks? How can we disrupt silos from forming? Who gets to show the latest feature and get the recognition that comes with that? So take those deliberate steps that break up this channeling, the tramline path I've said there that happens, and really build habits that just build in inclusion and opportunities in the day-to-day work. So really there's a good opportunity that we can be systemizing inclusion within processes that we're already carrying out. So this shouldn't really be an extra burden or extra resistance to the team, but something that fits in with how they're already working. So a request from me for you all here. We have an opportunity to partner up and test the effectiveness of this kind of Agile programming. So I've talked about inclusioneering. We're looking for 2 or 3 organisations to pilot this new approach, potentially across different Agile frameworks. So I'm looking for some partners to build and test and measure the effectiveness of actually doing these things. I've been talking to the BCS Insights team about it. They're all ready to publish case studies. Of course, we've got to do some to have some case studies to publish. So there's lots of good potential here, I think, to have some real pragmatic steps that we can use to make change, test out how it works, and to publish some results of where we get to with this. So please get in touch if you're interested to know a bit more about it. I've got a slide with all of my contact details on at the end, so just reach out on LinkedIn or put me an email and let me know if you're interested. So in summary, there's lots of stuff about Agile that's really well aligned actually with best practices for inclusion. But as we've seen, it's not enough. We do see those differences in how women and racial minorities have distinct task assignment patterns and distinct attitudes towards their careers. And also this importantly highlights that the experience isn't the same for all minority groups. That experience is distinct for different groups. So we talked about what you can do as an individual if you're in an Agile team or an organisation to try and build greater inclusion and try and advocate for yourself more. So with that, I'd like to just say thank you very much for listening. It's been great to have you all online here. Please reach out, get in touch if you've got any questions you'd like to talk about offline, and I'd like to open up chat and questions now. So,
okay, well, thank you very much, Jo. Very insightful topic for us to listen to this evening. And there have been a lot of questions about the culture in tech, and people talking about how do the diversity of different teams, whether people be not just from a race or gender point of view, but also from an autistic point of view. And how do you think that the companies can and individuals can help themselves really to deal with those challenges?
Yeah, I think neurodiversity in tech is a really important topic, and I think we know that within kind of engineering workforces, there's typically a high degree of people with those type of traits, even if not kind of diagnosed, but there's needs that people have that don't always go recognized well. I think when it comes to neurodiversity, it's really important actually that organizations have got some proper specialist support. I've seen, I guess, too many times where there's been somebody in a team who's had some, I guess, additional challenges because of autism that the company hasn't known how to support them, and has maybe taken steps that have made things worse, and the stressful situation has really become very difficult. So I think actually having some proper training and support around neurodiversity when teams do have a composition of people within them who are on the spectrum, for example, it is important to get that specialist support. Simple stuff though in the day-to-day that can really make a big difference. Make sure that people have got the option to have a headset on that they can block out background noise if that's something that's important to them, or they can be in light conditions that work for them. Really important that a manager and the team are just able to speak about it. So creating that environment where there's enough psychological safety for the person to express what they actually need, and for people to know how to listen and ask questions to understand that, and then make kind of the small adaptations that are needed there for it. So yeah, a combination of the small simple stuff, but actually get some professional advice about it as well, which I'm not.
Okay, thank you. And then, do you think Agile ways of working are actually more inclusive as it's been rolled out in more and more companies than other forms of technical teams?
I think it has the
could we do to
potential
try and make it better?
Yeah, no, I certainly think it has the potential to be more inclusive. My worry about Agile teams and self-organizing teams is that they've also got the potential to be worse than traditional teams. Particularly of these dynamics where people will just kind of reinforce those expectations they had of each other by, continuously following the same pattern of who gets assigned what and who's, seen as being the expert in what in the team. So in some senses, it's a little bit easier for a traditional team to break that, because the manager can say, right, okay, this person's just not had any of this particular type of task and they really want to develop, here, have some. But that's a little bit more difficult within the team dynamic. However, I think it is possible within the team dynamic, and that's where I'm really interested to start building up this Agile program. So looking at, working within the cadence of the sprint or whatever cadences are within the form of Agile that you use. So within the sprint planning, for the team to actually openly just talk about this. You know, what would you like to be developing? What tasks can help you to go along this path? And then, you know, as a team exercise, not only assign things to the people that can do it quickest in this particular sprint, but consider who has aspirations along what particular lines. You know, this is going to be beneficial, you know, not just for the individuals, but actually that cross-pollination of ideas is really shown to be very helpful for, you know, ability to be innovative and to spot problems as well. So managing risks is really much enhanced by having diverse ideas brought into the mix.
Thank you. And although the individual is left, I think it's still quite a poignant question that this individual has raised. He said, what is it, the chance that men are overstating the technicality of the tasks they are assigned? Could this be white men overstating their importance and women understating it? It was raised by a guy as well, this question.
That's a very interesting question. The research itself doesn't tell me the answer to that. I don't have data behind my answer in this. I mean, there's certainly a good chance that men and women perceive technicality differently, but I didn't measure that, so I can't really comment, I'm afraid.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Next question is, have you corrected for the cultural expectations of women? For example, being assertive is still a negative adjective for women, but a positive one for men. Considering being assertive and being indispensable to a manager, it's not a wonder why good women are not good managers culturally.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one thing to say is this research isn't comprehensive of all of the reasons why women don't progress within tech and engineering. So certainly that is a really important factor, that we have different kind of societal expectations of how men behave and how women behave. And it can lead to this, you know, what's known as the double bind for women, that they, you know, can either choose to be seen as competent and assertive, or they can be seen as warm and kind. And if they're seen as one, then it is kind of to the detriment of the other. Whereas that trade-off just doesn't exist for men, because we don't have that same expectation that a man's meant to be warm and kind. Of course, it's lovely when men are warm and kind and they get lots and lots of credibility for it. Just kind of expected of women. So yeah, that certainly is a factor. It wasn't something that was part of this research, but I do see that as a very important additional factor.
Yeah, and I think there are other questions that sort of link to that. Is I think it also depends on the stage that individuals are at in their careers.
Yeah.
And have you, when you were getting responses, were they different for those who are just starting out in their careers to those people who have actually been more mature in their career?
Yeah, there were some differences. Nothing that actually impacted the overall results. I did factor that into statistics. It's not going to come out. Statistical analysis, if you like. But yeah, there were some differences with age and with seniority, how people did answer.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, I don't actually expect you to answer this because it's a very personal question, but it's if you have any tips for sort of junior people who are starting out working in Agile, do you, or in the tech industry, from your own experience, maybe, that you could give some of our audience this evening?
That's a good question. Just starting out in an Agile team. Gosh, it's so long ago that was actually me. I mean, I think it's always important to, you know, be yourself, to be comfortable at work. You know, people talk about feeling that you can belong, and you know, I'd say if you're in a position at work where that isn't happening for you, don't feel burdened to change the team. You know, look out for yourself. I definitely see people who are in situations where things aren't going all that well, and you know, they'll kind of persevere to get through a situation that just isn't something that's within possibility to solve it. You know, so sometimes, you know, just say, okay, this isn't working, time for me to do something else, and move on to something that really is going to work for you.
No, I agree, and I think it, you know, my guidance is that, you know, if it doesn't feel right, talk to people. Don't try and solve it on your own, because that's not going to help.
Absolutely.
Another question is, can you share something on LinkedIn about the organisations you're looking for, so that people can share it within their networks about what you're looking for?
Oh, that'd be great. Yeah, thank you. Yes, possibly. My business is slightly complicated by the fact I do work part-time for another organisation as well. So please, can you get in touch with me just send me a message, email or LinkedIn, and I can send you some info about that. The general gist, by the way, is if you're using Agile and you're making tech, then that's the criteria. It's quite simple.
Yeah, I mean, someone's given some. It says, I think no matter where you are in your career, having confidence is vitally important.
Yes.
As without it, you can't function. So
yeah, absolutely agree.
You know, if you're not feeling confident, then you need to work with people to help you unlock your confidence, because it's all there within you, is what I would say.
It is. And I think that once you start having you know, some of those positive experiences, you know, psychologists talk about self-efficacy, you know, that belief that you can do a particular thing. And actually, I think that that's quite often a really important factor in it, is just getting, you know, take the scary step and get that experience, and then you can see you can do it, and that builds up your confidence step by step. So that's where it is, you know, can be really important to get, you know, someone from the team to help you and just, you know, give you support as you do the really scary stuff, and get the chance to try out the things that, you know, you're not necessarily feeling confident with yet.
Do you think all engineering leaders have to be interested in D&I to be effective?
I think all engineering leaders probably need to understand that, you know, a whole range of considerations impacts the decisions that they make, and that, you know, to be cognizant of, you know, all the range of voices that they're hearing, and to, I guess, include points from perspectives that they wouldn't necessarily expect. I don't know that they necessarily need to be experts in everything diversity and inclusion, but I think having that understanding that, you know, that breadth of experience really is, you know, hugely important to innovation and to managing the risks. You know, that's, I guess, more of an engineering focus on it. I think it is important that they're considering that. Better if they think wider, but I think that the baseline would be to be seeing it from that point of view. What do you think, Andrea? Andrea, are you still there?
Sorry, I leant on my mute button. So for me, it is actually looking at the individuals and what they bring to the team, and making sure that everyone is aware of what it is that they bring, and also what their expectations are. You know, it's about being open and having that trust in your teammates, and creating an environment which is psychologically safe.
Yeah.
The next question was about, how do you feel about doing things like project charters and using respect and inclusion frameworks in each team? Lots of people seem to be quite cynical and not take these kinds of things seriously. So an appetite to adopt such a deliberate and quite forced intervention can be low. But for me, the Agile Manifesto also talks about some form of, doesn't call it project charter, but it is about having those guidelines and having respect for your colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think that, you know, whenever you enter that kind of people working together situation, you go through what like a coach would call contracting. You talk about how you're going to work together. And I think that's a really important step. You know, you set the ground rules for, for how you interact. Maybe, yeah, if you're getting that reactions against it, it can be framed in a less threatening way. One thing that I'm, I guess, seeing fairly often is that, you know, diversity can seem quite threatening to people in that majority group, you know, that's going to be to their detriment, or that it's going to make life harder for them, and that, you know, the opportunities are all going to go to somebody else. You know, I think it's, you know, the team is everybody, them too. You know, those people do need to be supportive, and they need to be understanding, and they need to not feel threatened for it to really work. So there does need to be some, you know, some of that contracting that does account for the fact that they're probably worried by it. You know, let's put some reassurance in. You know, this isn't, you know, a zero-sum game. It's not taking away from you to give to somebody else. It's about building opportunities for everyone, recognizing everybody's contribution.
Yeah. Question is, I think overuse of technical language is a blocker. It seems to have got worse in recent years and can't act as a blocker to people engaging in tech, especially those lacking in confidence. And again, I think that's about talking openly about what it is that you want, what are your expectations, and the person also leading those activities also talk about the expectations, so that you can say, well, I can actually join in, you know, this is something that I want. And
yes,
if you don't understand, ask.
Yeah, completely agree. I think just creating that environment so people can ask, you know, safely, and, you know, it's comfortable to do so, you know, really makes a big difference. And actually, I think that's a really important point as well about, you know, that technical language being a blocker, because that really does impact people who don't come from backgrounds where they know lots of people who are techies. You know, they just don't have the same exposure as people who've been brought up in an environment where there's lots of expectation that, you know, tech is part of, you know, the life, and these are the terms that we use, and this is how we talk about it. So again, that can be like a disproportionate impact on different demographic groups. So really important that that gets broken.
Some of these are more statements, but I think they're still valid. You know, I think that with COVID, the landscape is changing rapidly around the expectations of all leaders, male or female, to be more emotionally intelligent, compassionate, and kind. And I think that that's true. And yeah, we should be looking to change things for the better and not allowing things to go backwards.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
I think this is a difficult one for maybe either of us to answer, but I can understand some of the how it can make people feel. But how do you feel about the language in engineering? So much is deemed by this particular individual to be racially loaded, you know, with black box, white list, blacklists. It's not how minorities treat each other. It's pretty key, but women as well. So it's there are some challenges that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think if it's, you know, if it's impacting people from different racial groups, then it matters. You know, it's important that that gets addressed. You know, another one that I've seen, you know, relating to gender is people querying, you know, should a Scrum Master really be called a Scrum Master? You know, there's a gender equivalent to that. And, you know, I think that can really matter to some people. And, you know, if it does matter, we've got to change it.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge it.
Yeah.
And probably one last question is, oops, I'll just scroll past it. Do you think women get pushed towards the mum jobs, i.e. responsible for the pastoral care of the team, organising tasks, etc., as the men aren't keen to do these roles and the women are perceived to be good at these activities? And has that come across in your research?
It didn't show up in my research as much as I expected it to, actually. So I didn't ask specifically about those kind of tasks, and it was a regret of mine afterwards, actually, that I didn't ask about, you know, how team-oriented is your task. So if I did it again, that's one I'd include. I did expect, though, that, you know, you'd see women taking more of the user-centric work, but that didn't show up. Actually, men and women reported kind of equal scores on that. Certainly in my experience and from other research, you know, women do get given more of those kind of team mum jobs. You know, they take the notes, or they do the things that help the team to work together and kind of do the, you know, glue between team members. And it's often work that's kind of assumes that they'll do, and it's not really acknowledged when they do it. You know, particularly in comparison to if a man had stepped up and done that work, he'd probably get recognition and it would be celebrated. So yeah, there's evidence out there in other research that shows that happens.
Okay, and I've got to ask this last question because, but I think then we should wrap it up for everyone.
Okay.
Is, Jo, in your experience, what actions or interventions will have the biggest impact? There are so many interventions, but what do you think people should focus on first? I think it's a good way to end and wrap it up.
Yeah, that's a very tough one to end on. I mean, yeah, in my D&I role rather than my research role here, I'd recommend that people really understand what's going on in their team and their organisation, and they choose the interventions that are going to address the problems that they can see are actually happening. I don't think there's any silver bullet, you know, do this thing and you're all going to be fine. You know, I think that it is really important that you actually, you know, undertake some research within your organisation and your team to see what's happening there. You can, you know, from identifying what the, you know, the key pain points are. You know, there's stacks and stacks of books that'll tell you, you know, if you're in this situation, do this, and then you can start working out, you know, from your situation, what is really the place to be starting.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jo, for sharing your research with us this evening, and thank you all for joining and being so active in the polls and with your questions. It's much appreciated. Thank you.
It certainly is. Thank you, everyone. Bye.